The AEI Executive Council works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of AEI, a nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The Institute offers various opportunities for students, including the Executive Council and the 2021 Summer Honors Program, and the links for such programs will be entered in the Q&A chat below. The Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, studies how American politics and government work and changes, analyzes how democracy might improve, and promotes political participation and civic engagement. The Institute explores state and national politics through research, education, and public service, linking the study of politics with its day-to-day practice. Dr. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. The founding and current editor of the National Affairs, he is also a senior editor of the New Atlantis and a contributing editor to National Review. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy staff under President George W. Bush. He is also the author of the book we are discussing today, A Time to Build, and the link to purchase will be in the Q&A box below as well. Today's conversation will be led by myself and Eagleton Institute Chief of Staff, Randi Chmielewski. Throughout the conversation today, if you have a question, there's no need to wait. Please type it in the Q&A box. Please share your name and campus affiliation with your question to give Dr. Levin a sense of the community here today and so that we can prioritize student questions.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council here at Rutgers for reaching out to Eagleton and collaborating on today's program. Thank you, Dr. Levin, for joining us today. Before we get into the conversation, I want to just take a moment to recognize Louis J. Gambaccini, in whose honor the Institute presents today's program and the Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series, of which it is a part. Louis J. Gambaccini sadly passed away in 2018, but he was a highly respected figure in New Jersey, perhaps best known for his role in creating New Jersey Transit, then the nation's first statewide public transportation agency. His final public service role was actually here at Rutgers as part of the Voorhees Transportation Center at the Blaustein School for Policy and Planning. He served at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for 3 decades, including as vice president and general manager of the PATH, where he was recognized for his strong regional approach to solving transportation problems. While at PATH, he was responsible for the construction and operation of the World Trade Center PATH station. He also served as Commissioner of Transportation under Governor Brendan Byrne and as manager of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, known as SEPTA, for more than 8 years. The Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series was established through the generous support of Lou Gambaccini's family, friends, and colleagues to honor his lifelong legacy in public service and his dedication to upholding the highest standards of civic responsibility, always striving himself and to inspire others to leave communities better and more beautiful than he found them. So I want to thank Mr. Gambaccini's family and friends and colleagues for making today possible, and want to specifically recognize his daughters Jill and Sue, who I think are joining us today. I also want to thank Max Vasquez, Gabriela Marone, Eagleton graphic design interns Rick Sarkar, Rabia Khan, and Kylie Johnson, as well as communication intern Alice Chen. Today, and all of the programming and the work of the Eagleton Institute are a team effort. With that, again, thank you so much, Dr. Levin, for joining us today to talk about your recent book. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to begin our conversation.
Great. So we're going to jump right in and give you a pretty large question personally. So Dr. Levin, thank you again for taking time to be with us today. So you open A Time to Build with an Aristotelian conservative premise about human nature, which entails that our institutions are essential for moral and social formation and a free and responsible society. You've actually touched on this view before in your 2014 essay titled Taking the Long Way. Can you talk about this perspective and how you define institutions and their formative role?
Well, thank you, Audrey, for the question, and really thank you both and all of you for the chance to do this. Particularly as a Jersey boy myself, it's always a thrill to spend any time at Rutgers in real life or otherwise. And I very much appreciate your question because it really gets to the heart of the argument of the book. The the premise you refer to is basically the sense that we as human beings require some formation before we can be ready to be free. That in order to be able to be full participants and citizens of a free society, a human being needs to be formed, needs to be educated, needs to be shaped, needs to be given the kinds of habits and instincts that can allow us to be trusted with an enormous amount of freedom, which we have in our society, thankfully. That assumption, and it is an assumption, is sometimes controversial in our society. There is really a dispute underlying a lot of our politics that I would describe as almost an anthropological dispute. The dispute is about whether the human person begins life ready to be free and is only unfree where he or she is somehow oppressed by some set of institutions that presses in on us, that forces us to live a certain way and not the way we would choose, that compels us in some form. So that what we really require of our politics is liberation from these institutions so that we might go our own way, or whether the human person begins fallen, imperfect, unready to be free. And what we require for liberty is not so much that our way be cleared, but that we be shaped, that we be formed and be made capable of exercising choice responsibly and effectively. I certainly believe that latter view is closer to right. It's not always right. There are obviously oppressive institutions in any society, and we can talk about that. But we also do require functional, formative, liberating institutions from family and community, education, religion, politics. Different institutions form different people in different ways. We prioritize them differently. But the basic premise really is that we need functional, healthy, formative social institutions if we're going to have a free society. And that part of the challenge we face now is both a loss of trust in those institutions and an actual loss of capacity among those institutions to shape us in that way and to enable us to be free. We're living in a moment when there is really a kind of social crisis in American life. We can see that in the polarization and breakdown of our politics. We can see it in the intensity of some of our cultural debates. We can see it in some people's private lives in the form of despair and alienation that lead people to seek the help of opioids, or that lead to higher suicide rates in our society. These problems are connected. They all strike me as forms of alienation, as a sense that we are somehow disconnected from the larger society, that it serves other people but not us. That frustration that this is here for other people but not for me is such a big part of what underlies the frustration of our politics, left and right in different ways. And so the book really tries to understand that problem, to think about why people have this sense, why people feel disconnected and alienated. And ultimately, that does come down, I think, often to a failure of institutions to serve their proper purpose, and therefore an inability on the part of a lot of Americans to trust the institutions of our society. The book tries to think about how those could become more trustworthy, and ultimately how we can find our way back to greater cohesion and a society that holds together better and serves its people better.
Thank you for that. I sort of introduction to the book and the approach. Want to pull through sort of the change element, the shift element that you talk about from this formative molding institution to what you describe as the performative platform institution. And one line from the book that really stuck with me in capturing this is, you write, the gradual replacement of the culture of integrity with something more like a culture of celebrity. And the problem with that being that you can't trust a person on a platform with great power. What exactly is this shift from mold to platform, from insiderism to outsiderism? And what are the consequences as you see them for institutions and for this isolation that you're describing?
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. Thank you. Maybe the place to begin is where Audrey's question ended up, which is to think about just what an institution is. Obviously, a term so broad and so important can be defined in a variety of different ways. And if you dig into the academic literature around institutions, you would certainly find a variety of definitions. But I think in a lot of ways, they add up to one broad way of thinking, which is institutions are the forms and structures of our common life. They are the shapes that we give to common actions and activities and purposes. Each institution in our society serves some important function, educating children or enforcing the law or serving the poor, providing some service, meeting some need. And it does that by establishing a structure and a process for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that task. It gives us each a role in relation to other people, and all these roles are ultimately organized around the common purpose of that institution. And as it does that, each institution also forms the people in it to carry out that work responsibly, reliably. It shapes our behavior, our character. It fosters a kind of ethic that's built around some idea of integrity. And that's why we trust an institution when we trust an institution. We might trust, say, a company, a business, because it promises quality and reliability, and it seems to reward its people when they provide those. We trust a profession because it imposes standards or rules on its members to make them worthy of our confidence. We might trust a political institution because it seems to take seriously some obligation to the public interest and to shape people within it to do the same. And then we lose trust in an institution when we can no longer really believe that it does that it has that ethical formative purpose. Sometimes that happens as a function of sheer corruption, when an institution protects the misbehavior of people within it rather than serving the people that it's meant to serve. And so when a bank cheats its customers, or when a priest abuses a child, that's an obvious corruption that makes it hard for us to trust the institution. But there's also another way that I think is more at home in 21st century America in particular. Obviously, we have institutional corruption, but what's newer to our time is a sense of institutional deformation, whereby rather than thinking of the institution as a mold, as shaping the people in it, we come to think of the institution as a platform, as providing a stage for those people to stand on and be seen, to build their prominence, to build their personal brand, to build their following, whatever language we might use to describe it. It's a way for people within an institution to simply use it as a stage to stand on and be seen. And especially in our time, to stand on and take part in the large culture war debates that have come to define our politics, so that whether it's a university or a newspaper or a church, they become platforms for political expression. And as such, they have a hard time doing their own work. The actual practical work of the institution comes to be made subservient to this other purpose of elevating individuals within them and giving them a platform. We see that very much in our politics. A lot of members of Congress, for example, now basically think of the institution that they serve in as a way to build their own brand, to elevate themselves, to get a better time slot on cable news or a bigger following on social media. President Trump has clearly used the presidency this way, as a stage. Rather than thinking of himself as an insider in that institution, he looks at himself as an outsider commenting on our politics, where the presidency is just a particularly prominent place to stand and do that. That pattern, which we can see not only in politics, but throughout in corporate America, and as I say, in the academy, in the professions, in religious life, adds up to a set of circumstances where it is very difficult to trust our institutions, to trust the elites that run those institutions. And everything comes to be dragged into one big partisan culture war. And that inevitably makes it difficult for people to feel like the core institutions of our society are there to serve them. They rightfully instead feel like those institutions have become deformed somehow, become harder to trust, and that in turn contributes to the intensity of the polarization of our culture war politics.
I wonder if you could, in the book, you drill down into national politics and give some specific examples. I wonder if you could talk through another really powerful phrase that you have in this book towards this idea of whether the institutional purposes are being served. This quote that you have, willful congressional dereliction, to me just stood out as such like an indictment. And I wonder if you could talk with us about a specific example from 2020 of before, during, since election day that further illustrate this for you, or that break from this, or an example of what someone in the role and within the institution would look like in terms of their actions in serving that congressional purpose versus this dereliction of duty?
Yeah, Congress is really the most prominent example of the kind of pattern I'm describing here, I think. And a lot of the problems in our national politics that we might think of as hyperactivity by the other branches of government, the growth of the administrative state and excess executive power by presidents in both parties, or judicial activism and over-assertiveness by judges, I think those are both functions of what I would call congressional underactivity, an unwillingness of Congress to step up and say that it is the first branch of our government, that ultimately public policy should be driven by congressional enactment because it's the most representative and democratic branch, and that really the president's job is to see to it that the laws passed by Congress are enforced, and the job of the judiciary is to see to it that the government functions in accordance with the law. It's all about the law, and Congress should see itself as in charge. But a lot of members of Congress don't like the responsibility that comes with that way of understanding our system. And instead, they've gotten comfortable in the last 10 years in particular with an attitude that views them as observers, as commentators on our politics, speaking on behalf of their voters rather than legislating on behalf of their voters. So that a lot of what they do is express frustration, and a lot of what they do is a kind of performative act. If you go to a congressional hearing now, you don't find members really in conversation with witnesses to learn something, or in conversation with one another to bargain over legislation. What you find is individual members producing YouTube clips to use later at election time. They're performing for the cameras. Everything they do is televised, and they know that, and ultimately they see themselves as empowered to speak rather than empowered to legislate, so that where you might have once seen members of Congress having sought out a microphone to run for office, gain power, and advance social change, we now more frequently find people who run for office in order to get a microphone and make a statement. You see this in both parties. It's especially true among younger members, it has to be said, who don't really have the experience of a different culture in Congress. And we can see it certainly in 2020 in the attitude the Congress has had toward the national response to the pandemic, where a lot of members have seen it as their job to basically judge the president's reaction. And look, it's part of their job. Congress certainly has a role in overseeing the actions of the executive branch, but there's been very little active interest in taking charge and in legislating in such a way that would guide the government's response. You see it more broadly in the way in which a lot of members of Congress basically view themselves as playing a part in the cultural theater that is our larger political culture, rather than bargaining with members of the other party to arrive at legislative action. Congress is ultimately an institution that exists to enable bargaining. And that means that it's particularly in trouble in a moment as polarized as ours, when each party basically views the other as the country's biggest problem, so that bargaining is just not what they're about. They're not interested in giving ground to get ground, because giving ground is the last thing that they think their voters would want to see. The result of that is just immense dysfunction. And I think it is really willful in the sense that members have changed what they want out of politics. And it is dereliction in the sense that it is not about legislating, but is about playing a part, a different role, a more performative and expressive role. There are some analogous deformations, certainly in the work of the president, especially the current president. In some ways, we can see it in the courts as well, but it is nowhere more advanced than it is in Congress.
Thank you. And I wonder if you could continue that sort of looking out to the other branches and the presidency in particular, and use a slightly different language around that in the book of, but the same thought pulling through proper constitutional ambition. And wonder if you could speak in particular to President Trump and the impact that you think he will have in the long term, that his presidency
Yeah.
and that experience and that example will have in the long term for the institution of the president. And then sort of also relating to that future vision, reading the praise on the back of the book from President-elect Joe Biden's former chief of staff, looking at this book, A Time to Build, as an ambitious blueprint for how Americans can work together to strengthen broken institutions we cannot live without. What is the blueprint that you might offer to President-elect Biden moving forward, at least with respect to the presidency?
Well, thank you. There's a lot there. I guess I would start by saying I think Donald Trump has in a way epitomized this concept of viewing the job as fundamentally performative. And it also, it helps to see that the way we think about the institutions we're part of is a function of having been formed by them. And President Trump has not been formed by our governing institutions in the way that every prior president had been. He's the first of our presidents who had never before served in elective office or in senior government role or a military role before becoming president. And what he did, rather, is he had a long career as a salesman in real estate and in our popular culture in a lot of ways, selling an image of himself very successfully. And he approached the presidency in a very similar way. He looked at it as a particularly prominent platform for the same kind of political performance that he'd been engaged in before. So that rather than thinking in terms of administration, which is ultimately the president's job, he has thought of it much more in terms of both channeling public frustration and just acting out a kind of political drama. And in a way, that has been taken by some of his supporters and some of his critics as a way of strengthening him in the presidency. So that we've seen critics who say that Donald Trump is an authoritarian, abusing his power to the detriment of our democracy. You see a lot of his defenders who say he's gone places that no past president has gone and done all these wonderful things. I think the truth about President Trump is that he's been a very weak president because he has not understood the job of the president from the inside, but has continued to look at it as an outsider the entire time. And what that means is that he's never really devoted much of his attention to administration. And the president's power comes from the president's duties, which are administrative duties. I'd put it this way. I think the president's job is to confront reality on behalf of our government. Congress has a different job. Congress's job is to set out legal frameworks, to build out programs and set priorities. Judges have a different job too. Their job is to make sure that the law is followed and adhered to. The president's job is in real time to apply the law and respond to changing circumstances, to live in reality. And a president who sees his job instead in performative terms is uniquely, I think, unsuited to living in reality. And we've seen that with President Trump, who tried to respond, for example, to the enormous crisis and challenge of the global pandemic, basically by talking it out of existence. The pandemic is a massive challenge. No president would have had an easy time with it. No country has had an easy time with it. But some of the distinct problems that we've had have come from an unwillingness to deal with reality. And I think those are particularly a serious failure on the part of our chief executive, whose job is really to deal with reality.
Thank you. I want to introduce a two-part question here, and I want to ask Audrey to jump in for the second part of it. And sort of the reality piece is a good shift for this in my mind, which is that so far we've talked about the positive aspects of a molding institution, including in terms of this concept of the president responding to reality, or in terms of the purposeful, constitutionally purposeful roles of compromise and bargaining to get us towards legislation and solutions. In service to that functional and free society from that initial conservative premise. I want to pause here for just a second before continuing the conversation to intentionally acknowledge and reflect on the role that institutions in our society and in our government, the processes, the frameworks, the structures of our common life, as you refer to them in the book, have played in either implicitly or explicitly limiting the roles that individuals from historically marginalized groups have had the opportunity to take on, and life outcomes. And in the case of police brutality, you know, the right to life itself. You directly state in the book, you know, again, one of these really powerful, clear statements, you know, that institutionalized racism is a very real and unavoidable facet of the American experience, past and present. So how do we build institutions, maybe for the first time, that ensure all people, irrespective of their basic humanity or economic characteristics, feel that sense of belonging and trust, and can see institutions of integrity in existence?
Yeah, so I think this question is actually related to a book that you wrote several years ago titled The Fractured Republic. And you argued that one of the central problems with 21st century politics was that it was too nostalgic. And you've also been one of the most prominent reform conservatives in the past decade. So I guess our question is, how do you strengthen institutions without doing it in a backward-looking manner?
Yeah, thank you for that. And it points to a very, very important caveat to any argument for institutionalism. I started out in response to your first question, Audrey, pointing to this difference in thinking about the nature of our politics, about whether institutions are fundamentally oppressive or liberating by being formative. And it has to be said that there is truth to both those views, right? Clearly, institutions can be oppressive, and in many circumstances they are. And as you quoted from the book, I think it is simply a fact that institutions have been oppressive in American society, including our traditional political institutions and social institutions. And so that a term like institutionalized racism is not a metaphor, right? That's a reality. And it's a reality that we have to confront in any effort to improve our society and improve its capacity to serve its people. The challenge is that can't be answered by saying, well, then we don't need our institutions. We should throw them off, burn them down, drain the swamp, the kinds of things we hear now in our politics in response to the perception that our institutions are corrupted or are oppressive. The trouble is we do need strong institutions. And it's especially people in our society who are not privileged, who are not well-to-do, or who don't have a lot of power, who need functional institutions. People with money and power are going to be fine, whatever happens. It's people who need their rights protected. It's people who need access to the benefits and privileges of our society. It's people who need the ability to rise, who especially need institutions to function, from schools and hospitals to a responsive and representative politics, to religious institutions and the family and community. And so we need to find a balance between the strength of institutions and the inclusiveness of our society. And to do that, we have to recognize there's a tension between those two things. Strong institutions often get strong by being exclusive, by marginalizing some people. And recognizing that alone is not enough, right? We have to actually do something about it. And so any case for institutionalism in our society has to also be a case for inclusion, a case for democracy. There has to be a balance struck between the need we have for the formation that institutions offer and the need we have for equality and for genuine individual freedom. That the fact that we need to strike this balance doesn't tell us how to do it, right? What it does tell us is that there will be times when we need to push back against the strength of our institutions, when it is excessive. There'll be times when we need to push back against the weakness of our institutions. And I think that we are living now in a time that particularly requires us to respond to institutional weakness, because that weakness creates a lot of the frustration, a lot of the alienation, and a lot of the division in our society. And so we have to remind ourselves now what institutions are, what they do, why they matter. But as we do that, we always also have to remind ourselves how they can go wrong. and to see where they have gone wrong in our society. And that includes looking at policing, it includes looking at systemic racism in other institutions. And so that gets to the second piece of this question, which you raised, Audrey, which is how do we avoid thinking that renewal has to mean reversal? I think renewal almost never means reversal. That is, we shouldn't think about solving our problems by asking ourselves, how do we get back to that golden age, whenever we think it was, when all this was working? There's a particular tendency in our society to think that that golden age was in the middle of the 20th century, to think that it might have been in the 1950s or 60s, when our culture was much more cohesive in ways that the right likes a lot, when our economy was much more equal in ways that the left likes a lot. And so when there was a lot to like about American life, but there was also a lot not to like about American life in the 1950s and 60s, especially if you were a racial minority, especially if you were an outsider in any way in our society. The cohesion of that form of American life was exclusive in a lot of ways. And what we've done since then is liberalize. We've liberalized our economy and we've liberalized our culture in ways that make it more inclusive, in ways that make it stronger. But we're also living now with some of the costs of that liberalization. And we have to see that there's a need now to rebuild cohesion and in some ways to bring us back together. That's just what it is like to live in a free society. It means that you are always responding to the mistakes you made in the past. And you made those mistakes by solving problems in the past. The downsides are the other side of the coin of the upsides in American life. These things go together and we always have to respond to the pressures we face. I would just say one more word about nostalgia. Our society lives under the burden of a very particular kind of nostalgia at this point. It's a nostalgia that I would attribute to the kind of older members of the baby boomer generation who really grew up in the 1950s and 60s and take that to be a norm, maybe take it to be a standard. And it's worth seeing, especially for students, for people in the rising generation, that folks of that age, and God bless them, there's nothing wrong with them, but they dominate our institutions to a very unusual degree at this point, especially given their age, right? Our president is 74. He's about to be replaced by a president who is 78. The majority leader of the Senate is 78. The Speaker of the House is 80. This is very unusual. It is not normally how American life works. And it's not just that we always have old leaders and these are just the folks who just turned old enough to be our leaders. It's the same people who've been running our core institutions for a very long time. I'll give you an example. President Trump was born in June of 1946. George W. Bush was born in July of 1946. Bill Clinton was born in August of 1946. And if you start to look around our institutions over the last half century almost, you would find that for a very long time, they've been run by people who were born in the 1940s and whose sense of what is normal in America, of what is worthwhile in America, was defined by a particular set of experiences that increasingly is not the set of experiences of most Americans. One implication of that is that our politics has a lot of trouble thinking about the future. We've just been through an election campaign that had amazingly little to do with the future. Very little of what was argued about was about what America is going to need in 20 years to be a successful society. A lot more of what was argued about was about whose fault it is that we have this problem or that problem, and is a kind of working out of grudges that have been with us for a long time. There's going to need to be some generational transition in our political life, in our cultural life, our economic life, and somehow it's going to have to enable our country to think about the future. And to my mind, it's important as that happens that we keep in mind the value and the importance of institutional responsibility so that as we think about what we need, we can see that part of what we're going to need are stronger institutions that are better able to both represent us and serve us and meet the various needs of our society. We simply are doing a poor job of that now. And a better way forward has to begin by recognizing that and thinking about what needs to change. So nostalgia is not going to get us there. We have to be at home in the present and think about the future. We can certainly draw principles out of our experience as a country. We have to, but renewal is not reversal.
Is that in some ways, hearing you say that, I'm trying to think back to examples of that being part of the mold of our, in particular, our governmental institutions or our business institutions, but is that a part of building in a new way institutions towards, again, less of the individual role, but towards this understanding of the lifeline and generational change, and looking to build in our work and in the way that we approach our work, not just what we can accomplish as ourselves, but how we leave that institutional knowledge and experience behind. Is that something that is new? Is that something that there are examples to pull from in terms of looking forward?
It's a fascinating question. I think there is an analogy in our history. It's not a perfect analogy, but there is an analogy to the moment we're living in now in what we broadly, loosely describe as the progressive era, which began similarly in a moment of division, of fragmentation, of intense individualism, in really extraordinary levels of inequality, huge waves of immigration that created a kind of cultural uncertainty. It took a long time. We went through those troubles for decades, not for a few years, but ultimately a kind of cross-political movement. We think of progressivism now as a movement of the left, and of course, in many ways it is, but progressivism began not so much as a partisan movement, but as a different way of thinking about America's way into the future. And, you think about the 1912 election, which was a kind of three-way election, Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. And all three of them called themselves progressives because they all thought about the challenges the country faced in terms of the need to revitalize solidarity. And the United States really did go through a period of increasing solidarity, not just around crises like the World Wars and the Depression, though that was part of it, but also there was just a change of disposition, a change of attitude. There's actually a wonderful new book by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam called The Upswing, just published last month, that describes that analogy, that really tries to get into what was similar and what was different. Very much recommended to you. And so there are some examples of the United States bringing itself out of moments of division and excessive individualism. Some individualism is good for us, but too much breaks down our society. And I think we can learn something from that. One thing I would point to is that there has to be a mix of renewing institutions and building new institutions. A lot of what the progressive era really did well was define problems in such a way that they could be targets for new institutions, civic enterprises that came from the bottom up at the community level, as well as public programs and political change that came more from the top down. I think we are in an earlier phase of a process that is going to need to lead to that kind of change, so that we come to understand ourselves as in need of greater solidarity. And you can see in some ways both political parties moving from a phase of their life when both of them argued about freedom, when each party tried to define itself as the home of individual liberty, to increasingly each party coming to think of itself also as offering a vision of solidarity. For now, both those visions are pretty crude and a little ugly, but I think they are working toward a politics where solidarity has a more central role. And it certainly seems to me that that's something we need.
Yeah, I hear you say solidarity, and I also echoes in my head as like shared responsibility across generations.
Absolutely. Responsibility. Responsibility is such a wonderful word. It's an American word. It seems to have been coined by James Madison. The earliest example of it that anybody can find is in Madison's notes on the Constitution. And what it really describes is that sense where you're confronted with a challenge and you say, well, this is my problem. Rather than folding your arms and waiting for somebody else, you take it on, and you take it on as a group. You sort of build a joint enterprise, an institution around solving that problem. Americans can be very good at that. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great observer of 19th century America, said that if you get three Americans together, they'll elect a treasurer. There's some truth to that, and we're pretty good at forming ourselves around that. But I think in this particular moment, we've forgotten how to do that just a bit, and we've got to relearn it.
And we've got some great questions coming through in the Q&A, and I want to encourage everyone who's on the line, if you haven't submitted one, to please do so and include your name and affiliation. And want to just ask, if you share with us one more step through that thought, which is that the Institute focuses very much on the practice of politics. And so appreciated part of you're thinking about the responses to this and how we move forward, being that they lay in the practice.
Yes.
And wonder if you could offer, some specific advice for the students on the call, and for the young generation, but especially the Rutgers students that we serve at the Institute, for real step one or step two that they can take to help build institutions of integrity as you've described them.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd start by saying that the first step is to think about our society as ours. That is, to think in terms of the first person plural. Catch yourself when you say them and their about fellow Americans, and find a way to say us and our. And when you find that there's something holding you back from saying that, think about what you might do to change it. And that can start to lead you in the direction of being a problem solver. If there are problems around you, right where you are, people who are short of food in the pandemic, or an immigrant community that seems to be excluded by those around it and needs some way to help its children become better integrated, find ways to do that, to just do it. Rather than to complain more effectively on social media about the fact that nothing's getting done, maybe we can do it. Starting at the bottom like that, where we are, is one way to play a more constructive role in our society. But I would say another is taking ownership in a larger sense, seeing yourself as a citizen, potentially an office holder, potentially an activist. Think about where you can get involved. I'll tell you this. I've been working in politics now in Washington for a little over 20 years. And in that time, I've become less cynical, not more, about politics. And I think that's often true of people who see it close up, because the most striking thing about politics, from my experience, is that everybody's trying to do good. Even the people who you think are destroying the country, believe me when I tell you, they don't think they're destroying the country. That's not their purpose. They're trying to advance some good, and they genuinely believe that that is what they're doing. That means that, first of all, when we think about people we disagree with, we have to ask ourselves, in what way do they understand themselves to be doing good, and what's right and wrong about that way? And secondly, it means that our politics really exists to enable people to take a variety of steps to try to improve things. And there are a lot of options for you as a student rising into our society, into your full citizenship, to take action. There are all kinds of steps you can take. If it seems like there aren't enough ways to do it, build some new ones. You can do that too. And my view of American life is not cynical. And I think the resources for us to improve on these problems are definitely there. So there's a lot of promise in the country you're inheriting. And if you see that, you should feel better about it.
With that, Audrey, I'm going to hand it over to you to pull some questions from our students and others in our audience.
Fantastic. So our first question is from Padmonk, who is a computer science student at Rutgers. And she asks that both sides, the Bernie Sanders left and the Donald Trump right, have embraced a form of populism that is distrustful of many longstanding institutions that they feel have contributed to their economic and social displacement. I was curious as to how you think these people can be convinced to renew their faith, particularly in government, which they feel does not care about them, and the quote-unquote elitist media, which they feel has contempt for them.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's obviously one of the crucial questions in our politics now. And as that question puts it, it's a challenge on both the left and the right. I think that it's important to try to separate what the complaints sound like in our politics and what they may be responding to that runs deeper than that, which is to say, I think a lot of the populism in our politics is a response to an absence of integrity in our politics, an absence of leadership that can be trusted. And the solution to that is not exactly to follow the path that's laid out by populism. That is, it's not to overthrow or burn down our institutions, to drain the swamp. That's what seeing what appears like corruption leads people asking for. But it's not necessarily exactly what we need. Or I put it this way, there's you can show up to the doctor and complain about being very tired all the time. And if the doctor knows what he or she is doing, they're not just going to tell you to get more sleep. They're going to see if maybe you have an iron deficiency, right? Or something else that you would never think to complain about. but that is underlying what you understand to be the problem. I think people who are engaged as leaders in our society have a responsibility to try to do that, to see what is it that's driving people to conclude that this society is not here for them, that it's not serving them, that it's for other people, that it's corrupt, and try to do something about that that isn't just a direct response to the complaint, but that gets at the underlying problem. And to my mind, that calls for more institutional responsibility. It calls for leaders who, when they're facing a decision, ask themselves, given the role that I have here, what do I need to be doing? Our president clearly doesn't ask that question and does a lot of things that a president shouldn't do. A lot of members of Congress, a lot of governors, a lot of our leaders now seem to fail to ask that question. They play into the drama of our politics rather than thinking about what their role is as leaders. And it seems to me that better leadership on that front, people who are more inclined to think of themselves in terms of the responsibilities that their power comes with, would help to address the underlying challenges of that drive that populism, and could help to change people's attitudes about their government. It's no small problem. Don't get me wrong. I don't think there's a simple, straightforward way to address that challenge. But I also don't think that giving populism what it's asking for would ever satisfy that problem. The populists in our politics have turned out to be a little bit like the dog chasing the car, who has actually caught the car. And what happens then? Well, apparently you just continue to run and bark. President Trump is president, right? That's as high as you can go. But it doesn't seem like there's much for him to do that's different from what he did when he was simply running for president. I think a real leader would see that there is more to be done with real power.
Great, thank you for that answer. Patrick Christmas asks, what do you think of electoral reforms that may arguably further weaken the major parties as political institutions? For example, nonpartisan primaries, ranked choice voting, etc.
Well, I would put those two in rather different categories, actually. I think that some of the intense polarization that we see in our politics now, much of it is a function not of the parties being too strong, but being too weak. Right? The parties themselves, if you think about it, are actually moderating forces in our politics. If you're the Democratic Party and you've got to run candidates in both Mississippi and Oregon, then you've got to build a pretty broad tent and try to drive our politics toward the center. Same thing for the Republican Party. But if you understand yourself as just one candidate who just needs to win one district in Texas, then you have no incentive to drive toward the center. You just need to figure out what your most intensely devoted voters want and do that. And oftentimes that means a more extreme kind of politics, so that stronger parties could help us build toward the middle much more than weaker parties can. And our parties have been weakened by some political reforms. I certainly think that open primaries have turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. I mean, it's a process that started in the late 1960s, that built up especially in the 70s, first in the Democratic Party and then the Republican Party. And it's turned the parties simply into platforms. The parties don't really shape the political arena very much. They're a place to stand, and they serve as a stage. And they end up empowering demagogues, really. I think stronger parties that are stronger by virtue of having more control over the money that flows through our politics, over setting the direction, the policy agendas, the communication agendas of the candidates, would serve our politics pretty well. I think rather differently, though, about some electoral reforms, like ranked choice voting, for example, which I actually don't think would lead to third parties or weaker parties. They would lead to factionalization within the parties, more liberal Republicans, more conservative Democrats in different parts of the country. And I think that would actually be good. It would be good for the parties, and it would be good for our politics if more of the diversity of the American people were represented within our two-party system. A lot of the diversity and the bargaining that happens between parties in parliamentary systems has to happen within parties in the American system. And it hasn't been happening very much within our parties in the last 20 years or so, as they've become very, very intensely consolidated and polarized. So I think some greater factionalization would actually serve both parties pretty well. And some electoral reforms could help that happen. I think that experimenting with ranked choice voting could be a step forward for the kind of political reforms that I'd have in mind.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Reuven Weintraub, who's a sophomore at Rutgers, New Brunswick. He asks, what are your thoughts on banning cameras from congressional proceedings? I think Scalia was right about how they would be used for sound bites rather than education.
Yeah, so this is taken up in the book, and it's something I've written about before. And I got invited not long ago to make the case against C-SPAN on C-SPAN, which was an interesting experience. I think cameras in Congress have gone too far. I don't think that there should be none, and it seems to me that cameras on the floor of both houses make some sense. Cameras in committee rooms make a lot less sense. If you think about what Congress is for, as I suggested earlier, Congress exists to enable bargaining and accommodation. And bargaining is basically impossible to do in public. If you see people bargaining in public, you're probably watching a show, not the real thing. And that means that the institution of the Congress needs some inner life. It needs some spaces that are protected in such a way that members can really negotiate with each other and not do everything in the public eye. If you talk to members of Congress who are on the intelligence committees, for example, especially the Senate Intelligence Committee, it's their favorite part of their job because there are no cameras. They get to talk to each other. They get to admit what they don't know. They get to learn from one another. They get to know each other. A little more time spent that way among members of Congress could go a long way toward enabling real bargaining and accommodation. They'd still be accountable for what they do, what they vote for. Obviously would still happen in public. A lot of the arguments that follow bargaining would happen in public. But I think congressional committees should stake out more spaces for their members to talk in private. If everything that happens in Congress is on camera, then Congress is really just a performance space. And nothing like real legislating can happen that way.
Great, thank you. And I think this is going to be our last question. So Tyler Seville says that you provide a thoughtful analysis of how older citizens are continuing to represent or control our government institutions, more so than ever before. What do you think the genesis of this is, and how might this change over time in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that people in my sort of generation in our politics ask ourselves a lot. I'm 43. There are a lot of members of Congress who are, in their 40s, early 50s, and have not risen to positions of leadership in a way that did happen in the past. And as I said, we've seen that in presidential politics too. And President-elect Biden is entering office older than Ronald Reagan was when he left office. And we thought that was quite old to be president. So something has gone on that front in our politics. And I do think that the dominance of the older boomers is an extraordinary cultural phenomenon. They've been able to hang on to positions of power and authority in all kinds of institutions. And look, maybe at some level, it's surely a part of failure of the middle generation, of my sort of generation, which has allowed that to happen. It's also a function of just people living longer and healthier. And I wish them longer lives still and healthier. But it does seem to me that generational renewal is essential to institutional renewal, that there has to be a sense that over time, the institutions are passed down from one generation to another. That encourages the young to think about the future. It also encourages older people to think about their obligations, their responsibilities to the younger generation. I actually think it ultimately also encourages everybody to think about the past too, and what we can learn from prior generations. And all of that requires just a greater willingness to allow for generational transition to happen. You see it in all the institutions, this problem. I mean, if you look at a university, and again, I wish everybody involved the longest lives possible, but people stick around into their 70s and 80s. The Supreme Court, similarly, it creates some very bizarre challenges for our society that depends so much on these institutions. And I think that over time, as we do live longer and healthier lives, it's going to become necessary to develop some kind of ethic of retirement, of stepping aside at some point and allowing that generational refreshing to happen. And, it's hard. I mean, nobody wants to ask an older person who's experienced, who's maybe doing a fine job, to step aside because of age. But I think our society is going to have to learn how to think concretely about generational succession and transition. And it's just one of the challenges that comes with an aging society.
Thank you. And I hope, for all on the call, and especially for our students, that you can take some of that optimism of agency, and, that thinking through. And we look forward, our students, to each of you, getting engaged at Eagleton, and for our helping to support you and getting engaged and participating in this system across all levels, local, state, national. Dr. Levin, want to thank you so much for spending the time to talk with us about A Time to Build today. You can see that we could talk for a long time if we had the opportunity, but we want to be respectful of your time today. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. I also want to invite everybody that's here with us today to come back on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. when we'll be having our next Gambaccini Civic Engagement Series speaker, Minneapolis Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins, will be with us talking about trans visibility and empowerment. Council Vice President Jenkins is the first African-American transgender woman elected to council in a major U.S. city. Details for that session and registration are at eagleton.rutgers.edu, and also at eagleton.rutgers.edu is a link to purchase your own copy of A Time to Build. So thanks to all, and thanks to you also, Audrey, and the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council at Rutgers for making today's program possible. Be well.
Thank you, Randi.